Dr. Brzezinski, as you know, I went to Moscow last year to interview then-President Putin, and he made it very, very clear that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster, in his estimation, of the 20th century. Is he now trying to put the genie back in the bottle and bring these states that were once part of the Soviet Union back into the fold, and therefore creating a new Cold War?
Well, in effect, that is so. When he makes a statement to such a dramatic effect, overlooking the fact that the 20th century was punctuated by World War I, by World War II, by the Holocaust, he is really signaling his intentions. And he's using force or boycotts or pressure on the former members of the Soviet Union, but now independent states, to bring about some new form of imperial control over the former Soviet space.
And here's my question for you now. I mean, for so many Americans, this has just sort of popped up on their radar out of nowhere. But you mentioned the First World War. But the conflict between Russia and Georgia and South Ossetia has been going on for 2 centuries. Let's talk a little bit, tell us a little bit about the history that you know so well of what's going on here, because there are 2 sides to this question.
Well, Georgia was incorporated into the Tsarist Empire back in 1801, and it was subject to control by Moscow until the breakup of the Soviet Union. So, in effect, Georgia was dominated by Russia for 190 years. The Georgians are now in the 2nd decade of their independence, so it's a brand new experience, exhilarating, very, very important to them, but also very vulnerable. Ossetia and Abkhazia are provinces of Georgia with ethnically somewhat different people, but people who are not Russians. And the Russians, for the last 5 years, have been making every effort to separate these 2 provinces from Georgia, all the while repressing the Chechens, who are part of the Russian Federation, because the Chechens wanted to separate from Russia. So there is even a great deal of irony and hypocrisy in the Russian conduct. The Georgians in the last few weeks, got finally terribly impatient, and when 6 of their policemen were killed, they initiated a rather inept, in my judgment, military effort to reintegrate Ossetia into Georgia. The Russians were ready, and they pounced.
Right. I think you made the point that President Saakashvili may have actually been lured into a trap by Russia. But just to clarify things for viewers, I mean, the people who live in South Ossetia, and there are about 50 to 70,000 of them, do consider themselves Russians, don't they? Wouldn't they rather be part of Russia?
They consider themselves to be distinct from the Georgians, but they consider themselves to be Ossetians. And I think the issue is one that could have been negotiated. The problem is that the Russians have been using force over the last 5 years to impose a different status quo on Ossetia, also Abkhazia, and another province of Georgia closer to Turkey, Adjaria, which the Georgians have in the meantime succeeded in reintegrating into Georgia.
Now, Dr. Brzezinski, I know you are in favor of Georgia having become a member of NATO, and it seemed as though that was in train to happen. What would have happened if Georgia was a member of NATO? Would Russia not have done this? Would we be on the brink of World War III? What would have happened?
Well, let me be more specific. I was not in favor of integrating Georgia into NATO. I was in favor of granting Georgia something that the Georgians have asked for, which is a membership action plan. It's a program which prepares a country to join NATO at some future date, provided it meets the standards of that action program. It takes several years. Okay. So there was no question of introducing Georgia into NATO right now.
We were talking a little bit about NATO a moment ago, Dr. Brzezinski, and what I'd love to hear from you is, what can the international community do about this? There aren't a lot of sticks that America has or Europe has. A third of Europe's oil comes from Russia. What should the international community be doing?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize what the issue is. I think the issue is one of principle. The issue is also one of geopolitics. Geopolitically, an independent Georgia gives us access to the oil and energy of the Caspian Sea, of Azerbaijan, which would be terribly vulnerable if it was cut off, It gives us access even to Central Asia. Morally, the issue at stake is how do nations conduct themselves? Do they use force to impose their will, or do they seek accommodation? And that's the principal issue involved with Russia. Do we have means of pressuring Russia? Well, first of all, no one rational is urging war or military collision or even a return to the Cold War. But the fact of the matter is that Russia is now increasingly part of the global system. It itself is also vulnerable to consequences that undermine that international system. And if Russia threatens, for example, to reduce its energy shipments to the West, it loses an enormous amount of income, it loses its credibility as a supplier, and it tempts the West then to perhaps react in some fashion. For example, if the West, on a desperate basis, has to buy its energy elsewhere and pay much more for it, there are now billions, hundreds of billions of dollars from Russia by Russian oligarchs deposited in the West. That makes them vulnerable to the consequences of any significant downturn in normal, constructive economic relationships. Ostracism also has an impact on the new Russia. The Russian elite sends its children to schools in the West. It likes to travel to the West. It likes to be part of the club. In brief, we shouldn't really think of this problem in traditional military terms or in terms of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. Although a lot of the things that you're describing are kind of hints at the Cold War, a kind of new Cold War, maybe not quite as cold as before. In fact, I think you're on record, I believe, saying that one of the ways that the West could protest is to boycott the Winter Olympics in Russia that is coming up. Is that the case?
Well, if the issue is not resolved consistent with international norms by some accommodation, if the Russians insist on a unilateral seizure of these Georgian provinces, then 2014 is the year when the Winter Olympics are to be held right next door to these seized provinces. Well, then the question would arise whether the West should participate in these Olympics. But we have time for that. I don't think that moving towards sanctions right now is the right moment.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk a little bit about now Prime Minister Putin. George Bush, when he first met him, had a glimpse of Putin's soul. The United States started to try to bring Russia into the family of modern nations. Is Putin now doing something to kind of say, look, we're not the kind of Western folks that you thought we were. We're trying to kind of put the genie back in the bottle and recreate imperial Russia. Is that what we're seeing with Prime Minister Putin now?
I think that's a fundamental question. And actually, I think from Russia's point of view, what Putin has done is rather damaging, because Putin has discredited a kind of naive policy of friendship with Russia, which Bush and Rice were propagating. He has shown that Russia's conduct today is rather different from the norms pursued by other major powers. Look, in recent years, in modern history, we have had Germany acting in a fashion that was not acceptable. Yet today, Germany is a stalwart democratic country, a leader of Europe. We had Japan acting in a fashion that was not acceptable. Japan is a pillar of democracy and a good citizen in the Far East. China is rising as a power, but is doing it cautiously and carefully and with respect for international norms, in most cases, though with some question marks about Tibet. Russia stands out right now as a country that is revisionist and is threatening not only Georgia, but Ukraine and the Baltic states. It's been waging cyber warfare against the Baltic states. It's been using economic sanctions against the Baltic states. That is what Putin has done, and I think he's damaging Russia and its long-term political and economic prospects.
Dr. Brzezinski, I want to thank you for joining us this morning from Maine. Dr. Brzezinski, a former national security advisor who is an expert on Russia and the Caucasus, who helped clarify the situation for us on this special edition of G.